5% increase in gun background checks over last year. The more than 185,000 checks came on the same day as the mass shooting at Planned Parenthood in Colorado that killed 3 people. Now, despite wide calls for gun control, including yet another plea from President Obama for change in the wake of this latest shooting, it doesn't seem like national politics are primed to do anything soon. Now, that's in part due to the savvy of the gun industry's lobbying efforts. Josh Israel of Think Progress is with me now to discuss his report on how the gun industry has circumvented regulators in order to avoid the fate of big tobacco. Hi, Josh. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we just start with big tobacco, right? Talk to us about how the cigarette market has evolved over the decades. Why you use it as an example?
Well, in the 1950s and 60s, the Mad Men era, about half of Americans smoked. And you could smoke just about anywhere, in workplaces, in restaurants. I even, as a child in the 80s, remember people could smoke on airplanes. And of course, the smoke would waft into the so-called non-smoking section at the restaurants or on the plane. And nowadays, that is no longer the case. And there has been really a sea change in the tobacco industry being held accountable. The number of Americans who smoked has dropped to about 1 in 5. And yet, over that time period, the number of Americans who own a gun has gone from about 50% then to about 50% now.
So how do you think the gun market will be able to avoid the same fate?
Well, they've used a number of tactics, and pretty much anything that's worked to reduce smoking or hold the cigarette industry accountable, the gun lobby has very cleverly moved to avoid. So things like people talking to their doctor has played a huge role in people not smoking or quitting smoking. The gun lobby has been proposing model legislation, and we saw Florida actually adopted it, prohibiting doctors from even asking their patients if they own a gun. The government did all sorts of medical research into the dangers of smoking and how best to quit and the like. So the gun industry and the gun lobby have successfully pushed for gag legislation, including the Dickey Amendment, which prevented the government from researching anything that might cause quote-unquote gun control. And the court process that held the tobacco industry liable, as soon as people started seeing that being successful and tried to apply that to class action suits against the gun industry successfully got a liability reform through the Republican Congress and signed by President Bush.
I guess the question that probably a lot of Americans ask themselves, though, is how Congress lets that happen, though. How it is that they block any type of gun control legislation, considering that polls will consistently show support for more background checks, bans on assault weapons. Don't they have to be accountable to their constituents in some way?
Well, we have a very gerrymandered Congress right now, and just by the virtue of the fact that big states and small states have the same number of senators, we'll always have a very gerrymandered Senate. And as a result, you have a lot of people who are experiencing the worst of gun violence, who live in urban areas, big cities, and those members of Congress tend to be among the most supportive of taking action. Yet, the industry has very cleverly cultivated a base of support among those who represent the more rural areas, who happen to control more seats in Congress as a result, and more seats in the Senate. And through that process, have been able to avoid any sort of public accountability, even though the majority of the country would support things like background checks, making sure that you can't get a semi-automatic weapon. The people who actually are voting on those members of Congress are not always necessarily the ones who are representative of the majority of the country.
Yeah, of course. So in that sense, too, would you say the gun lobby learned a few things, from big tobacco and the way that it was taken down, and and that's why it has also successfully found its own workarounds?
Absolutely. And one of the things that they saw was that localities were among the leaders in creating smoke-free zones, in getting smoking out of restaurants, in taking action to make sure that secondhand smoke doesn't contaminate the lungs of everyone wherever they go that doesn't necessarily want to breathe it. And so what the gun industry has done in almost every state in the country is they have managed to pass preemption legislation to make it so that no locality can enact any gun laws and that they have to be decided at the state level. So a big city where they have a major gun violence problem and people may be facing secondhand bullets they don't want to be experiencing can do very little to get guns out of those areas and to make those areas safer, because the state government has taken away their ability to do so, and because the gun lobby was smart enough to get those laws passed before the localities could take action.
And before anyone or most people seem to notice, right? Definitely
Absolutely.
very, very shady stuff. Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.